Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be continuing our work on our woodworking bench. So I got the shopsmith set up here, and we're going to joint some of the sides of the boards and see if we can't get a nice smooth surface so we can run them through the table saw, rip them down to 3 inches, and then possibly joint them, and we'll see if we can get some wood glue today.
If you have a shopsmith and you have a jointer, that location that I just got that power coupling from is a great place to keep it, between the fence and the safety there, or the guard if you will. So that way you can always find it when you need it. Here I have a test board that I'm running through the jointer before I actually put the boards for the project through, and I always recommend checking your settings and making sure everything is set correctly before you actually run it through, so you don't screw something up. So what I have is just a piece of scrap, piece of spare 2x4 that I'm running through, and then I'm going to use my square to check the fence angle and making sure everything's set correctly before I proceed. So now I'm adjusting the depth for the infeed table. I don't want to take very much off. I just want it to be enough that I can get a nice smooth surface on each of the boards. And I'm going to start with the long ones. Before I run anything through the jointer, I'll usually check and see which side is cupped down as far as the ends, see if there's anything that I have to contend with, as well as check the angle on the direction of the grain, I should say, to make sure that the jointer cuts downhill, if that makes sense. So the grain is running from top to bottom, more or less. So I want to make sure that runs downhill, that way it doesn't chip out and things like that. The other thing with these longer boards that you have to do is, you'll notice that as I get it further off the end, I have to use more pressure to keep the back side down. So you'll see the front side dip a little bit, and I'm making sure to keep my pressure on the back end just to keep it level on the outfeed table. So I am going to run all of these boards through, including the legs, the frame, and the supports, and all of that stuff. And the reason I'm doing that is because all of the lumber for this project I'm going to cut down to 3 inches. So I want to have a smooth surface on one side so I can run it through the table saw. And then once we get through the table saw, you'll see that we're basically going to take it and join it a second time, and then we're going to run it through the table saw again. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to be able to select which side of each board I cut off, and this way I could get rid of any knots or any mars or dents or anything that's on that side of the board that I didn't want to keep. So here I have a couple wrenches for the shopsmith that I'm trying to unscrew the nut on the saw blade attachment. And the problem that I had was that this wrench was spread open, and you can kind of hear in the background here that what I'm doing is I've set it on its side, and I'm hammering on it to try to close up the wrench so that it grabs correctly. And then I'm just going up and checking it. And what you can essentially do is you can hammer it closed, and then you want to put it on its side and make sure and level things out again to make sure that it's even. And once you get that adjusted, then you can actually use it correctly. You can see here it pops right loose, so that worked. So what I'm doing here is I had the crosscut blade on, and I'm switching it to the rip blade. And there's typically 3 types of blades. I only have a crosscut and a rip. So depending on what I'm doing, I'll switch the blade out for the appropriate blade so that I can do what I need to do. And since we're going to be ripping these boards, I'm putting the rip blade on so that I can do that. And this nut on the shopsmith is reverse threaded, so that's something to keep in mind if you have one and you need to switch these out. So from here we're just going to get things set up so that we can rip those boards. So I attached the saw blade attachment with the Allen screw, and then we're just going to lift the table so we can slide the headstock and the blade underneath it, and then we're going to lower the table down so we can get things set just right, install the fence, and get that set up to, I believe it was about 3 1/4, because I wanted it to be a little bit long, because what I'm going to do is I've got one side jointed and I'm going to run it through and rip it down, and then I'm going to join it again, and then I can choose whichever side I want in order to remove material from that side of the board. So here, with the joiner, I'm using a test board, and this piece gets stuck here, and you'll see that as soon as I grab it, it pulls it through and throws it down on the floor. So you'll notice I was standing on the back side of the fence, so there was very low chance that it could actually hit me, and all I did was grabbed it barely with my fingers, just enough to get it to either pull out or do as it did, where the saw blade threw it through the table. So yeah, I want to be careful with that, and kind of want to keep your fingers away from that as much as possible. And you can see here on the left side of the screen that I have a table with a box on it set up. I don't have a standing roller that I can run for long boards. Put it on the back end and you can run the board across it. There's a lot of people that have these. They're really handy. I don't have one, so what I did was I set up a cardboard box on top of a table, and you'll see here once I get close to it, I end up tipping that up a little bit and then resting it on there, and that way I don't have to worry about supporting the back end and keeping it down on the table. So then we're just going to run all of our boards through here, and as you can tell, I'm just barely taking some off the surface, just enough to make it nice and square, and then I can joint that end, and from that point I'll have both sides jointed, and I can decide which side I want to take that material off of on the last cut. So once we get everything run through, then it's pretty much a reverse of where we were before as far as configuration. I'm going to leave the fence on there, and then it's just a matter of taking the saw blade off, moving your headstock over, and then using your power coupling to hook back up to your joiner again, and then running everything through again. And once again, this is just a minimal surface smoothing, so I'm not taking much off. I'm basically just taking off the sawn parts from when we ran it through the table saw just now. That way it's nice and smooth for the fence. So here we're back to the table saw configuration, and I think I have the fence set for about 3 1/16, just enough so I can take about a 1/16 off of the sawn surface on the joiner once we're done, and then we'll have our final width of about 3 inches. And you can see I'm running the test board through here to make sure everything is nice and square and even again. So if you're ever curious about being able to make paper with a table saw, you can see the really thin pieces that are coming off of here are pretty much paper. So then we switch back to our jointer configuration so that we can take that last 1/16 off and get our final dimension down to 3 inches and have 2 smooth sides so that we can glue them together. So here I'm just running it through the jointer to smooth that last edge, and once again I'm using a test board to make sure that the fence is still square and that everything is good. If you remember, we left our project boards a little bit long so that if we had any errors or we needed to, we could re-square the ends. So in order to do that and run them through the table saw to take the ends down to where we need them, we have to use as much of our Shopsmith as possible. So what I did was I removed the joiner and I moved the table extension to the other side, and I'm switching the rip blade out for a cut blade, or excuse me, the rip blade out for a crosscut blade. And I'm going to slide this table, once I get the blade installed, I'm going to slide this table all the way down to the other end so that we have as much distance as possible so that we can support our boards and run them through there without having to worry about there being a short distance between the table and the blade. So with our saw depth set, because I know these boards are straight because I've run them through one side and through the joiner as well, I use that to level the table extension so that I can make sure that I have the correct support and be able to make that end nice and square when we cut the excess off. And here I'm just going through and marking the final length on all of these boards. I am checking both ends to see if one of them is less square than the other, and in this, the end that I am cutting off is the end that is the least square. So you'll notice here that I'm not using the fence for this, and the primary reason is because it's just not feasible. If I put the fence on the far end of these boards, it would have a high possibility of twisting and kicking out. So basically what I'm doing is I'm freehanding each one of these so that I can control both ends of the board and I can run it through smoothly without it catching or dragging on anything that we don't want it to. So now that we're done with the long boards, what I'm doing is I'm moving the table extension back to the other side, and that way I can actually use the fence because these are shorter boards, and I'll be able to use the fence on the far end and then the miter gauge as well, so we can keep it nice and square as we slide it through here. As you can see, I'm holding both hands on the miter gauge, and I move the saw blade to the far end of the table so I could use as much of that table surface as possible. And at long last, we are finally ready to do some gluing. So everybody has a different method. It's what works best for you. For me, I just don't see it feasible to put glue on both pieces on this kind of work because it is the tabletop and it's something that may eventually get replaced in the future. I figure as long as I put one bead on one of the boards and then spread that out and make sure it's got a nice even coating on it, when I press them together, it usually seems to spread the glue out in a decent fashion, enough to make it nice and solid. And you can see here I put 2x4s on the outside. This is so I don't squish up or dent or mar the sides of these boards, because eventually I'm going to be gluing these sets of boards that are glued together with another set of boards. So I want to make sure that I maintain that smooth surface on the outside edge. And what I found works best is to slightly tighten the center clamp and make sure that the boards are nice and even when you do that, and then from there you can adjust the ends and get everything to where you want it. So now that we've got one set glued, we're gonna pull these out. And one thing I didn't do on the first set was wipe the glue off. I did it on subsequent glues just because it's easier than trying to chisel it off or scrape it off or however you want to do that. But these are all going to go through the planer anyway before we actually glue the main sets together. So each one of these boards is 3 inches wide, so these sets are only 6 inches. So you can see here I go through with a dry towel, and then I end up going after that with a wet towel just to make everything nice and smooth. So now that we've got all those glued, you can see here I'm gluing those two together like I mentioned earlier. And once we got those, we've got a 12-inch wide board, and my planer is a 12.5-inch planer. So it works out perfectly, and I was really questioning whether this planer would be able to handle a full 12 inches of board running through it. And to my surprise, this thing actually took it like a champ, and granted it needed a little bit of assistance running it through, but it ran right through it planed it down nice and smooth, and I didn't have any issues with it. So, and we did this, took just a marginal, probably a 1/16, maybe a less, maybe a 32nd off of each side just to get them nice and smooth. And then we're going to glue those together using the same method we used earlier. So we're going to glue those two, and then we're going to add the third set. And in order to do so, what I have is, so I have pipe clamps, and these pipes are 3 feet across. So I'm not going to have enough to be able to put the clamp on the back end. So what I've got is another 3-foot section of pipe with a coupling. So I can screw that on and then put the clamp on the back end, and that way I can clamp all the way up to 6 feet. And if it needed to, which I don't see any need for it in the future, but I could do another set of couplings and pipes and go for as long as I wanted, or I could only do 2 clamps and use the 2 pipes from this one to make those 2 up to 9 feet and kind of go from there. So one of the issues is that coupler it raises the wood off of the pipe a little bit. So what I'm doing here is I got some scrap pieces of lumber, and I'm just finding one that's the same height as that coupling, and then I'm just snapping it off and basically shimming that board on the left so that it sits at the right height. And then from there it's standard operating, where I go through there and make sure everything is lined up and nice and smooth, and then we clean it off. So in my experience, I've found that the further your clamped surfaces are apart, the more likely it is to flex away from the pipes, and it has a potential to pop up. And so in order to prevent that, what I did was I actually put my planer on top of it, because it's got a nice amount of weight, and I can actually use that to keep that from bowing up, and that way it'll keep it nice and flat and give me the surface and the glue that I want. Alternatively, if I had more clamps, I could put 2 more clamps in between the clamps I have on there now, and the pipes on those would technically keep it from trying to bow up. So anyway, I think that'll wrap up episode 2 of our woodworking bench project. So hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to click the notifications so that you can be notified of future content. Leave any comments below, any questions that you have, and I'll make sure and get back to you on those. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.